Hi guys, welcome back to What's This Weapon? I'm Jonathan and this is one of the Thorneycroft rifles. So those of you who have purchased my jumbo-sized doorstop, aka my book about British Bull-Pup firearms, will know this pretty well. Otherwise, you may not have heard of it. The genesis of that book was actually a series of blog posts that I wrote in support of Ian's videos, Ian Forgotten Weapons, and he was going through the various British Bull-Pups, and I was writing sort of additional bonus content, as it were. And a couple of people said, why don't you turn that into a book? So I did, and it's available in the shop. But I've never actually gone back and put a Thorneycroft on camera, and because the one Ian looked at was the third pattern, what I very inventively called the third pattern of 3 patterns, I thought, let's go back to the first one. I also wanted to share some new information on a new British Bull-Pup, who knows, maybe a second edition, that was shared with me by David DeLawrence. Thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. He's been trawling through American Rifleman and finding all sorts of interesting references to Bull-Pups in general. And one of those was something I'd never heard of, and I think very few people have heard of, even if they read about it in American Rifleman in 1970, they probably forgot about it later on. There are no examples known to be extant. This is something called the Gamwell Rifle. Now, this is kind of what you would expect this to be. It was a conversion of the Lee-Metford rifle. Well, it could have been a long Lee Enfield, but he used, he being Harry Gamwell, I don't think he's known for anything else, but he converted the classic full-length Lee-Metford rifle into a Bull-Pup, putting the trigger and the grip in front of the magazine. Now, James Baird Thorneycroft and Mowbray Gore Farker, who are 2 of the best names in firearms history, working together on this one, took a different approach. They went for scratch design. So we think the driving force here is Mowbray Farker, Scottish chap, who's an actual practicing designer and engineer, and ended up with, I think he had 25 patents to his name. He's known, if you know the name and you don't know this, you probably know him from the Farker Hill self-loading rifle, which was going to be adopted in 1918 as a British service rifle, which didn't happen. But or maybe from the Beardmore Farker light machine gun, which got some traction. We'll come back to both of those in future episodes. So I'll try and neuralize you so you don't remember that, and we can surprise you and you can guess what it is on our social media accounts, which you presume some of you will have done for this. But you might have been thrown off by the fact that all 3 Thorneycrofts look quite different. Just to finish my thought there on Thorneycroft, so the chap who gave his name to this thing, James Baird Thorneycroft, he was probably the investor more than anything else. I mean, he did have an engineering background. He presumably contributed to the design in some way. It was never clear to me how much. His name went on the patent, but the lion's share of the design work, I'm pretty sure, was Farker. But in any case, so the genesis of this was mounted infantry. So the British military concept, well, not exclusively British, but within the British Army, you had cavalry of different types, and you had infantry, of course. The idea, a little bit like the dragoons of old, was that infantry could use horses purely as a means of getting where they need to fight, and then they would dismount and they would fight as riflemen. Slight constraint there is with a full-length ordinary bolt-action rifle of the late 19th century, you've got a fair bit of, not so much the weight, but the length. If you're trying to draw this thing, the traditional way around this was a carbine. So you'd shorten the whole thing right down, you'd lose velocity, potentially a bit of precision, depending on how that's done. So your bullet would fall off at distance at the very least. And you might lose a bit of terminal effect as well if you cut the barrel down, certainly at distance. So the idea, this is really the origin. There are earlier Bull-Pups that were made for sort of target work for different reasons, but as a military firearm, the idea of a Bull-Pup is to bring everything back. We've got the magazine back here. You can't see it in this because it's fully encased in wood, but when we look in with the bolt open, we can see the magazine follower. So you've got your 5-round magazine in there. You put all of that back here instead of up here, or rather, look at it the other way. You take the breech face or the trigger. Different people use different sort of datum points for defining what a bullpup is or isn't. In my book, I went with the breech face and like the majority of the gripping area, because we were trying to define a bullpup firearm. And otherwise, you end up including a lot of pistols and other wacky things, more wacky things. But with a rifle, it's fairly straightforward. You can move the trigger in front and you can define it on that basis. But that brings everything back, so you've got less sticking out the front. Now that could be sort of tactically useful for fire and maneuver and maybe for balance, arguably. But really what this was useful for was replicating the overall length of a carbine, so it could slot into a cavalry scabbard, or boot as it's sometimes called. Easily drawn out, potentially with one hand, depending which side you're doing it from the wrong side. If you stayed in the saddle, which mounted infantry weren't supposed to do, you could bring it into the shoulder and fire it one-handed. And they did actually test this out later on. But the idea was you would be off your horse, you draw it from the scabbard whilst on foot, and then bring it into the shoulder. And it would work just as well as a full-length rifle, because it is a full-length rifle, only not. That's the whole point of the original Bullpup rifle. This was not at a time when they were calling it Bullpup. The term Bullpup is an Americanism from later on, 1930s, 40s, when this thing was reinvented again as another target thing for sort of nerdy reasons, really. People thought they could design the best rifle, and they reinvented this idea. It was invented at least 3, maybe 4 different times in different places for different reasons. But in this case, it was all about making the whole thing shorter. So Thorneycroft and F.W.A kept the 303 cartridge because they were trying to sell this to the British military, so they knew they were stuck with the 303 cartridge. And really, there was nothing wrong with that per se. Not the most powerful thing around, but powerful enough, and has a rim, but who cares at that point. But everything else was completely designed from scratch, except for the bayonet, because again, they know that the British military is committed to the pattern 1888 bayonet. So they want to be able to fit the standard bayonet. And you still have enough length in this. I mean, it's a little awkward. If you have to grasp it behind the trigger guard, it's a little bit short for bayonet fighting, certainly for the day. Not as short as an SA80, obviously, but I'm sure they would have worked around it. Maybe they would have grasped it right at the butt here and worked around it like that. Don't know. But certainly this first pattern was designed to take the P1888 bayonets. Weirdly enough, the second and third patterns weren't, and they took a proprietary type of bayonet, which is lost. At that point, you might have noticed, if you haven't already, that we are missing both sets of sights. So the whole rear sight assembly is missing. Thorneycroft had a patent for a type of rear sight, which we should be able to show you. It gives you an idea of what that would have looked like. And we have the later examples, although only on the third pattern, and it had changed a bit by then. And even the front sight has been removed. Clearly, they were doing some experimentation and cannibalized sights off this, or was trying out different sights retrospectively. We don't know, but they are missing. The really interesting bit, of course, is back here, and we've got that very pronounced gap here. The third pattern from 1904 that you might have seen on Ian's video is, by my own definition, like really borderline a bullpup, like maybe even not. This is very clearly so. So we've got the breech face here, we've got the trigger here, the magazine is behind. We've got a really pronounced gap here. Like whichever point you choose, the magazine is back here, giving you a full-on bullpup arrangement. Now, because of that, because they're trying to replicate the ergonomics of a conventional rifle in a very unconventional design, that's why you have this pronounced dropped buttstock that isn't just a buttstock. It's also the magazine. It contains the bolt mechanism. So you have this very unconventional look to it. And it's back here next to your face, of course. And there's more going on even than that, because in order for that to work, for the butt to drop down, the bolt has to drop down as well and come up a ramp. So what's known as an inclined bolt. Not a very creative name, but that's what it's called in the literature, certainly later on. Even as late as the SA80 development in the early 1970s, they looked at, and we have the mock-ups for this, inclined bolt designs. Why? Well, the bolt has to come up and meet the chamber and feed a cartridge, of course. Your eye, though, has to be behind the sight. So you drop the buttstock down, so your eye is behind the sights. That means there's really only one option with a dropped butt, and that's to have the bolt come up a ramp, and then the bolt face, in this case at least, to be cut at an angle, so that when it rotates into alignment and locks up, it's square. It actually meets square on, and everything fits as it should. So you have the breech face cut at an angle, and you can also see in there the interrupted thread locking lugs that this thing has. I think this type of rifle is unique for a turn bolt rifle. The Ross rifle, famously, which is straight pull, does the same, uses the same interrupted thread locking. So like a screw thread, but cut to create, or you can look at it the other way and say it's got twin locking lugs at the front, like a Mauser, but they are cut so that each mini lug is bearing pressure. It's a different way of doing it. Arguably not the best way of doing it, but this is what they went with. And there, of course, are grooves in the chamber that those lugs align with and go into when you rotate the bolt handle down. Speaking of the bolt handle, like a cavalry carbine, it's turned down, but it's drastically turned down. It's not just cranked down, it is flat, almost flat. So you have no actual knob to get hold of. You've just got this flanged surface, which is also checkered underneath for a better grip. So you're supposed to finger and thumb still, like with an Enfield or a Metford, and operate it that way. But it's almost like a spatula shape. We have, well, cocking piece, so you can separately cock or recock. If you get a misfire, you can recock and restrike. We have a safety catch on top of the bolt here. Now that, when it's applied halfway, and it does click into place, prevents you from opening the bolt. Now, if we combine that feature with this lever, which drops the magazine follower down, well, that does two things. Firstly, it works a bit like a Krag-Jorgensen rifle when you open up the magazine, in that releases all of the spring pressure in here. You can take, in theory, a handful of 5 rounds, bearing in mind the charger loading feature of the Enfield Lee family rifles hasn't yet come in, 1901, when this is being worked on. We can drop in, probably a bit more slickly than I've just done it, in theory, drop them all in one go, and then in this lowered position, we can close the bolt over those 5 rounds with the safety catch applied, and now this weapon is loaded with 5 rounds, but you cannot even chamber a round. That's its ultimate safe mode, designed in this first version. You can then operate the follower lever to bring the rounds up into the feeding position. You then need to also switch off the safety catch. You can then, I won't do it because this thing is a bit old. You can then chamber the first round and then carry on firing as normal. This catch, if we drop it back down, obviously that's quite an expedient way to unload compared to having to short stroke cycle the bolt to get all of your live rounds out if you need to make the thing safe. So this catch works in tandem with this lever as a sort of ultimate safety. If you then had a round, if you did have a round chambered, placing the catch in the same position does the same thing, of course, but it also doesn't stop the cocking piece from releasing, but it does stop it reaching the primer. Stops the firing pin reaching the primer. So it's like a fail-safe safety as well. Maybe not ideal, because then you'd have to recock, turn the safety off, and then re-engage. But that's the way it was designed. So quite a lot of complex design going on here. In the event, it didn't kind of prove very necessary, but there was some interesting thinking happening for sure. And then that final, so if we release the tension on the cocking piece, the final mode is all the way over, and then we can remove our bolt, give the bore a pull through, and we get a slightly better look at our bolt assembly there. There's the bent and the half cock position for the cocking piece. We've got our interrupted thread lugs, and you get a very nice clear view there of the angled bolt face, which becomes straight as it goes up the ramp and turns into position. It becomes a straight bolt face, but the body of the bolt's facing downwards. Really quite a curious beast, this thing. And there's also a groove there for a fixed blade ejector, which is, sorry, not a fixed blade, correct myself, a spring-loaded ejector blade, which comes down out the way and pops up when necessary to punt out the empty case or the live round if you're ejecting it that way. But as demonstrated, you can drop the follower and unload it like a crag if you want to. So I've given a couple of dates here, 1901, 1902. Well, this thing's being developed through 1901 into 1902, and the patents, there are two main patents that apply, one from 01, one from 02. The first patent, 18th of June 1901, that's significant in terms of the basic concept, and it provides us a definition which is really the same as many modern people's definition of a bullpup. The distance from the shoulder to the trigger should remain as in ordinary rifles, so in other words the length of pull as we would call it today. The trigger is placed forward of the magazine, and connection between trigger and firing mechanism is made by providing a connecting rod or lever. Now in this design, again we should be able to show you in the patent, so slightly unusually with this design, the rod, which is a solid stiff rod, so slightly better trigger pull than it might otherwise be, runs under the magazine rather than around it, which is interesting, to connect it to the sear to release the cocking piece forward. Best shown in the patent drawing, really. And then the rest of this design, notably the magazine cutoff / loading device, and it is described as such in the patent, comes in on the patent of 9th of June 1902. So by summer 1902, this thing is in theory ready to go, except that within just a couple of years, we have gone through two more iterations, the second pattern and the third pattern, which we might revisit in future. In the meantime, let's quickly compare with the rifle this was supposed to replace. So here we go. This is what they were trying to replace, the Lee-Metford rifle, reasonable length to it. How did they do with this first pattern? Bearing in mind that James Thorneycroft was a family member of the commanding officer of Thorneycroft Mounted Infantry and was in that unit as well, you would hope that he and Farker would have come up with something that was substantially shorter, and we can see that they did. If we use a table as a measuring stick, well, the Metford doesn't even fit on the table. The first pattern Thorneycroft is, I'll get the figure for you, but it's a good 10 inches shorter, I would say. So that worked pretty well. What we find with the iterations, the second and third pattern, is that they compromise how bullpuppy it is, and the overall length does grow a bit to try to, I guess, please people who've given feedback as to this maybe not being ideal. But skipping to the end, what we find is, so this is what they're trying to improve upon. This is what these two guys come up with. And this is, of course, what actually happens. So 1902, I've already mentioned 1902, this thing is already happening. It's a done deal. So in-house, the British establishment, quite rightly really, has product improved the Lee-Metford and the long Lee Enfield, the magazine Lee Enfield, and improved it into the short magazine Lee Enfield. So short overall, magazine fed, and the James Paris Lee's rifle action and the Enfield rifling in the bore all come together to create the truly iconic British service rifle, the SMLE. And this thing, barely a blip on any, certainly on any infantry radars, bit of a blip on the cavalry radar. There's an article in the Cavalryman's Journal where they discuss how it could be a really good thing. And to be fair, you can see it is even shorter than the short magazine Lee Enfield, but only by a couple of inches. This thing lived just fine in a scabbard or a boot, whatever we'll call it, on the side of your horse. So, as is often the case with these weird and wacky designs in this collection, the juice was not worth the squeeze, and although we had 2 more iterations, it didn't go anywhere, and it would be another 50 years before the British would come back to the Bull-Pup and try again. So, as for the Gamwell rifle, which hopefully we can at least show you a picture of, if anyone has any information on where the heck that thing ended up, let me know. Frank Hobart wrote about it. It was with his granddaughter, I think, in 1970. No one knows where it is after that, or at least I don't know. So if anyone has a lead or any thoughts about how we might be able to track that thing down, I'm fairly sure it didn't end up in the museum at Bisley, for example. But if anyone knows where that is, we would love to know. Even if we don't take possession of it, we would just love to know where it is, study it, because in a way, it makes more sense as a conversion. That would be a much closer rival, I dare say, to this, which was already in train, compared to a completely unproven, untested design that frankly was never going to go anywhere. That said, they're always going to favour their own in-house design, and who can argue that the SMLE wasn't a magnificent service rifle? I'm certainly not going to. Thanks for watching, guys. We really appreciate it. As always, like, subscribe, do all the YouTube things. Check out our website for any events. And actually, we do have some fun stuff coming up. So we have a Call of Duty live stream, Team Royal Armouries against Team CoD Firearms Museum. Right then. Challenge accepted.
Oh, I've grenaded myself for the umpteenth time.
Damn it. I just respawned and heard that explode.
Now, we do have a bit of a ringer in Team Armories, and that is our friend Dave Jewett, who also has some very exciting news to announce, that he and his colleagues are starting a new channel called EXP, and one of the things on there is going to be involving me again, doing the Expert Reacts material that a lot of people enjoyed quite a bit previously. So that's coming back, basically, along with some other exciting stuff that they're going to be doing. So whatever you do, join us again here next week.